Today's daf is daf Lamed Gimel, and we'll start on the second line. The Gemara has quoted Rabbi Yehuda in the name of Shmuel a number of halachas, and we'll continue with that. Amar Rabbi Yehuda Amar Shmuel Ksava al Shnei Dapim Psula. So we said that there are dapim, columns, and he took the mezuzah. Now here's machlokas exactly how to interpret the Gemara, but let's go with Rashi's pshat. He wrote one parsha on one column and another parsha on the other column. Tosas learns that he wrote one parsha on one cloth, and he had a whole different cloth on which he wrote the second parsha, Boyim Shemor. It comes out that according to Tosas, if he had two different parshios in two different columns, but on the same cloth, the mezuzah would be ksheira. So Rashi would passel the mezuzah because it's written in two columns. Tosas is going, even though it's one parchment, Tosas is going to passel it because it's on two different klafim, on two different parchments. Meisvei. Gemara raises the following objection from a brisa. Ksava al shnei dapim v'nicha b'shnei sipin. Psula. So now, what this brisa is talking about is where, again, going according to Rashi, he had one cloth, but he wrote the two parshias on two different columns on that same cloth. But according to Tosfos, it works a lot better, a lot simpler, because he wrote it on two different klafim, and he nicha b'shnei sipon. So the sipon is the doorpost. So he put one cloth on one doorpost and another cloth on another doorpost. Sachakol, he's got one mezuzah if you could connect the two, but you have to put them all in one. And the Gemara says, of course, that we can be medayik. It's only possible because it's not on the same doorpost. But ha b'saf echad, had it been on the same doorpost, even though it would be two different klafim, according to Tosfos Pshat, or according to Rashi, two different columns, then ksheira. And that's against Rabbi Yehuda Amar Shmuel, who clearly invalidates the mezuzah that's written on Shnei Dapim. So the Gemara says, Re'uyil Shnei Sipin Komer. It doesn't mean that it was actually on two different doorposts. In fact, the Brisa would not have even addressed that case because that's obvious that it's not a mezuzah ksheira if he has only one parsha on one doorpost and the other parsha on another doorpost. But rather you have to reread the Brisa, or push in a few words in the Brisa, that it was re'uyah l'shnei sipin, which would mean that the reason why it's possible is because you could have actually put it on two different doorposts, which according to Rashi means he would have cut, with a knife, he would have cut the two columns that are connected to one parchment. According to Tosas, he's got two different parchments, and therefore, even though it's not on two different doorposts on the same doorpost, but it's two different parchments with one parsha on each, and therefore it's psula. Another statement of Rabbi Yehuda Mishmuel, b'mezuzah halach acher heker tzir. So their doors were a little bit different than our doors. We use hinges that are on the side of the door, but they had a tzir. A tzir is what's called in English a pivot. And what does it mean to go acher heker hatzir? The Gemara is going to have cases in Hilchos Mezuzah. These are the shilos that always come up, and the rabbis are being asked these questions in Mezuzah. What you have is like an outer room and an inner room, and you don't know whether to put the mezuzah on the door, but towards the outer room, or on the inside of that doorpost on the inner room. And according to the Gemara, again, based on the way they made doors in those days, everything depends upon the tzir. Where you put the pivot. Sometimes you put the pivot on this side of the door, sometimes on that side of the door, and that's going to determine where you put the mezuzah. My heker tzir, Omer of Ada, Avkisa. Now, Avkisa is literally translated as a socket. In other words, there's a hole in the sill. That's where the pivot of the door turns. And therefore, Kigon, Hechidomi, it's a case of Pischa de Beitrei Bati. So there are two different houses, and the two houses are connected to each other, and they have an entranceway which is between the two houses. Bein Bei Gavri Bei Noshi. What happens is they wanted to have an outer house where they could have guests and entertain people, but there would be an inner house where the women, the mother or the wife, would be able to take care of whatever she had to do in private, in a domestic sense. So now the question is, the door that connects these two houses, where do you put the mezuzah? On this side or on that side? On the women's side or on the men's side? And that would depend upon where this tzir is, where the pivot is. By the way, this word tzir is even used in modern Hebrew. Reish Galusa Bana Besa. So you know that during the period of Golus, there was some Jew that was always uh, in charge of all the political and economic needs of the Jewish community. He was called the Reish Galusa, the head of the Golus, and in fancy English, he's called the exilarch, from the word exile, meaning the head of the exile. Generally speaking, he was from Beis David HaMelech, so he was sort of like a quasi king. Anyway, he turns to Rav Nachman and he says to Rav Nachman, Kvali mezuzasa. I want you to fix my mezuzahs for me. He hadn't yet put up the doorposts, and he wanted him already to put up the mezuzahs. Amar Rav Nachman, Tli Dashi. Dashi means the doorpost. Beresha, first put up the doorpost. Now here we have to introduce, and it's going to come up again in the sugya, a halachic principle called Taseh Velomina Asli. Whenever the Torah tells you to do something, the Torah means to say that at the moment you do it, that's when the mitzvah is completed. For example, you can't put up the schach until you have the necessary and critical, you fulfill the critical requirements of the defanos. Once the defanos are up, then you can put up the schach. If you put up the schach first and then the defanos come later, that's a problem of tasa velomina osui, meaning it's already there, and yet the mitzvah is not fulfilled because you don't have a sukkah yet. So putting up the schach without a sukkah is a psul, and it invalidates the sukkah. You'd have to take apart the whole thing and put it back on top. I mean, there's no psul hefza here, but the schach has to be put up again a second time around, or you shake the schach, whatever you have to do. And here, by process of equation, in the case of a mezuzah, if you put up the mezuzah before the doorposts are up, then it's already osui. It's not yet tasa, because in order to do tasa, you have to put the doorpost first. The doorpost is now mechayev the mitzvah sukkah of mezuzah, and then you put up the mezuzah on the doorposts. Another statement. Oh, this one is in the name of Rav. Until now, it was always in the name of Shmuel. Omar Yehuda Marav, Asa'ah Kimin Negar or Neger, different ways of pronouncing that word, Psula. There's another Psul in the Kiyum Mitzvah of Mezuzah. And the word Negar means a bolt, like that round thing, a bolt. They used to use that, to bolt down the wall. It was down the door. I mean, say it was usually on the bottom, towards the bottom, and it attached to like holes on some sort of a platform that you put on the floor. And Rav is telling us that if he just simply, if he puts the mezuzah on the doorpost by bolting it in, like they put the bolt to bolt down the door, that's psula. Now, why is this a psul? So the answer is that, at least according to Rashi, there are two ways of setting up a mezuzah. One is, and that's what we know, we don't know of another possibility, is that it's vertical, it goes up and down. However, in the Gemara's time, and it even rolled into the time of the Rishonim, there was a possibility of understanding the Torah as if the mezuzah should be going this way, horizontally. And according to Rashi's pshat here, Rav is telling us that if he put up the mezuzah horizontally, then it's psula. And the Gemara right away objects. V'haki asa Rav Yitzchak bar Yosef. Rav Yitzchak bar Yosef was a Talmud of Rebbe Yehuda Nasi. And very often Rav Yitzchak bar Yosef would testify about what he witnessed was the custom of Rebbe. And in this case, he tells that he knows from personal witnessing, he could testify that in Rebbe's house, the mezuzahs were horizontal. Kula mezuzasa devei Rebbe kimin neger havi avidan. Vahi pischa di al be Rebbe lebe midrash lo avi. Okay, that will pick up a little bit later in the sugya that Rebbe had an opening into his study hall, and he did not put up a mezuzah on his study hall. Maybe because the study hall is for Davish of a Kedusha, and therefore you don't need an extra mezuzah. Whatever it might be, we'll see later on. But we're interested in the narration, the first part of the statement and the testimony of Rabbi Yitzchak regarding Rebbe, that his mezuzahs, Rebbe's mezuzahs, were all horizontal instead of vertical. And the Gemara answers lo kasha. Ha di avida kisichta, ha di avida ki isteriva. Okay, so we have something called a kisichta. Now, kasista, which is the invalid kind of mezuzah, which, if you remember the quote in the name of Rav, that he validated it, and that was made like a peg. What does that mean? It was made like a peg. It was nailed horizontally into the door. And that's completely excluded because the final maskana of the Gemara is that the mezuzah has to be vertical. But ha'avidi, when Rebbe's mezuzahs were, like we said, made like a bolt, and we thought it means it was done horizontally. No, it was like an isteriva. Isteriva is a part of the leg above the foot, but below the knee, and we would call it an ankle. And basically, an ankle means that it, like here's the foot on the ground, and here's the ankle going. It's going up. It's like I guess you'd call it an L shape. And basically, I'm not exactly sure whether Rebbe's mezuzahs like curved from the bottom going up, like an L, or alternatively, there was like a little bit of a platform that held the mezuzah. But the bottom line is that Rebbe's mezuzahs were vertical, not horizontal. So now the Gemara wants to know about not why didn't Rebbe have to put up a mezuzah on his study hall? Aini, is that possible? When the Pesach, the entranceway, in which Rav Huna would enter into his study hall, Havi le mezuzah. And therefore we should assume, based on Rav Huna, that a study hall does in fact require mezuzah. So therefore, how can it be that Rav doesn't require mezuzah? I mean, or let's say Rebbe, because of the testimony of Rabbi Yitzchak. Hahu rogil hava. It all depends upon how many entranceways you have into a study hall, or for that matter, into any room. There's one entranceway which is commonly used, but they used to have a separate entrance coming from the other side in order to avoid all the traffic, or for, let's say, more tzniistic reason, whatever it might be. So what we're talking about is that there's a Pesach which is called Ragil, and even in the case of a study hall, such a Pesach requires a mezuzah. And then there's something called Eino Ragil. where you don't really use it. It's just an extra door, like a side doorway. Tiyom Rabbi Yehuda Marav, another statement in the name of Rab, b'mezuzah alach achar ragil. If you have two entrances into a room, which entrance requires a mezuzah? The one that's ragil, the one that you usually use in order to enter into that room. Later on, which is going to be Shabbos, Daf Lamed Dalid, the Gemara is going to say that if you have two entrances, you have to put up a mezuzah in both. So the Rishonim are going to try to reconcile our Gemara with that Gemara, because our Gemara here seems to assume that you only have to put up a mezuzah on the ragil, on that entranceway, which is the main entranceway. Now, in the case of Rav Huna, when we testified that Rav Huna actually put up a mezuzah, that was a reference to a side entrance, but it was apparently they used to use that side entrance to enter into the study hall. And I can testify myself about certain shuls, which during the week you have to go in through the side entrance. You know, they don't even open the main entrance. So that means 6 out of 7 days of the week they go through the side entrance. That becomes the main entrance as far as mezuzah is concerned. But as I mentioned before, Lamaisa, the Gemara is going to say that we put up a mezuzah on both entrances. Omer of Zera, Omer of Masna, Omer Shmuel. Mitzvah lanicha b'tchila shlisha elya. So let's say you have a doorpost, and the doorpost is, let's say 10, let's say 10 feet high from just. So then you put the mezuzah on 67. If you follow me, from 67 and higher, that's the top third. Rav Huna, however, says magbia min karka tefach. Basically, it could be anywhere along the doorpost, as long as it's not lower than a tefach. A tefach is about 6 inches close to the ground. So once you climb up 6 inches above the ground, Rav Huna would say you could put the mezuzah anywhere in the doorpost. Umarchik min akora tefach. Okay, now you have the top part of the door, I think it's called a lintel in English, whatever it is, and you have to go lower than the top by a tefach. So according to Rav Huna, as long as it's above the ground by a tefach and it's below the top by a tefach, anywhere in between, you could put the mezuzah. Meisvei, the Gemara is now can ask a kash on Shmuel. Magbia min akarka tefach. The Brisa says that all you have to do is put up one tefach above the floor, marchik min akora tefach, and it should be far away from that korah, the beam that goes horizontally on top of your door. And that means that this Brisa, quoting Rabbi Yehuda, would support almost word for word what Rav Huna said against Shmuel. V'chol ha'pesach kulo kosher mezuzah, as we said. However, Rabbi Yossi in the Brisa disagrees, and he says, Omer, ukshartem uksavtem, which means that there's a hekesh between ukshartem tefillin and uksavtem al mezuz beisecha mezuzah. What does that teach me? Mak shir begova af ksiva begova. So according to Rabbi Yossi, we're equating mezuzah with tefillin shel rosh. Tefillin shel rosh is above the head, on the top. Therefore, the mezuzah with regard to the doorpost has to be on the top. So that this halacha, that you have to go one tefach below the top, is rejected by Rabbi Yossi, based on this equation between tefillin and mezuzah. So the Gemara says the following: Bishleim el Rav Yehuda, hu diyomer ki Rav Yehuda, Rav Huna, sorry, Rav Huna, who says that you could put it anywhere along the doorpost, and the mezuzah could be low, 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 as long as it's one tefach above the ground. He is reflecting, as we said before, word for word the Shita Rabbi Yehuda, that's fine. El Shmuel the Yom Kiman, Lo Rabbi Yehuda, Lo Rabbi Yossi. Shmuel doesn't work out with anybody. Why? Because Shmuel says it has to be in the top third, and according to the Brisa in the name of Rabbi Yehuda could be all the way on the bottom except for one tefach, and according to Rabbi Yossi, it could be all the way on top, above that tefach. And the Gemara answers, Amar of Huna Bereder of Nasan Olam Ki Rabbi Yossi. Rabbi Yossi, Shmuel can be reconciled with Rabbi Yossi. And here we turn to Daf Lamed Gimel Amid Beis. Umay Tchilas Shlish HaElyon Deka Amar. Rabbi Yossi said, I'm sorry, Shmuel said that it has to, the mezuzah has to be 2/3 of the doorpost up. And that's laharchika shlo laharchika b'nakora shel mali yosem mishlish. On the contrary, what Shmuel was saying is that just make sure that you don't have it lower than the top third. In other words, if let's say you calculate, we'll try the number 10. So you calculate from the floor all the way to the top. You make sure, says Shmuel, that you don't put the mezuzah at 6.7. Say make sure it's not below the top third. But Einochinami could go all the way to the top. In those days, they had they didn't have like we have, a very thin kind of an entranceway. They had a very thick. It was made of stone, and it was very thick. You could still see this in many countries. And you have to make sure that the mezuzah is on the outer part, not on the inner part, because the idea of the mezuzah is that it has to protect the entire house. So if you put it further inside, then there's a certain part of the house that's not being protected. And Rava goes even a step further. He says that, let's say, the thickness of the wall is 6 tefachim. You'd have to put it within the first tefach that's close to the street, to the outside of the house. My timer Rabbanan Amri Kidei Sheyifka b'mezuzah miyad. The Rabbanan say the reason why he has to put it on the outside, close to the street, is so that as soon as he enters into the bisharecha, into the shar, into the doorway, immediately he comes in contact with the mezuzah. But Rav Chanina Misura Amar, what I said before, Kihechi did tintere. Again, tintere is a conjugated word for netira. Netira means shmira. And the mezuzah has to guard the house. So you want the mezuzah to guard the entire house, so therefore you want it on the outside. Now we go on. Omar Rab Chanina, this is a certain agadita. Bo re'eh shelo kamidas HaKadosh Baruch Hu midas basar b'dam, midas basar b'dam melech yoshev b'fnei v'am misham. So who guards who? The people will guard the king. Make sure that nobody enters into the king's palace. But it's all built around, the king. He's the this. But midas HaKadosh Baruch Hu eino kain. You would think that we should be protecting God, so to speak. God is the king. No, it's just the opposite. Why? Because Avadav Yoshem Yifnim V'hu Mishamram Yilachutz. In the case of mezuzah, God is protecting us from the outside. We're on the inside, so we're like treated like kings, and God is protecting us as if we were, we as if we were not the servants of God, but we were the king. And how do we see this in a pasuk? So this pasuk is in Tehillim Perek Kuf Chaf Aleph, very famous pasuk. Shenemar Hashem Shomrech Hashem Tzilcha Yad Yeminecha. God is the guardian, and He provides our shade. Shade is a homily for a guardian, for protection, at the right side, at the right hand. Dorash Rav Yosef. Now, the word darash here doesn't mean what it means in modern parlance, a drasha, like, the rabbi gets up before Musaf. Drasha here means that they used to have let's say on Rosh Chodesh or more likely on the Moed, and they used to have like a public halacha shir that was delivered by the Rav. And Rav Yosef, the son of Rava, in the name of Rav, would say the following in his drasha, in his public, when he addressed the people. He'emik la tefach psula. If instead of putting the mezuzah on the outside towards the street, he affixed the mezuzah deep into the kosel of his house, of the door, even more than one tefach, that's 6 inches, then it's psula. Lema Misayele, should we support him from a brisa? Anicha v'patzin o shetola aleim malbein. Now, I don't know exactly why a person would have done this. Maybe he wanted to protect his mezuzah, but he placed a brick on top of his mezuzah. And the other possibility is, so that's called Tola Oleha Malbein. Malbein is a brick, and it comes from the word Malbein, which is a rectangle. So the bricks were rectangular in shape. And then there's something called Patzin. Now, what exactly is Patzin? Patzin is probably just the doorpost itself. So if that be the case, what exactly is the Brisa coming to teach us? Im yesham tefach tzorch mezuzah acheres, v'im lav eno tzorch mezuzah acheres. So the question is, where exactly did he put his mezuzah? Because the outer surface of the doorpost, or that which faces the outside, if it's more than a tefach thick, then he doesn't fulfill the mitzvah if the first mezuzah is placed on the inside. Therefore, he has to either take down the mezuzah and put it up again, or put up a second mezuzah. But basically, this is a support brisa for Rava that says that you're not allowed to recess the mezuzah into the doorpost beyond a tefach. If you do so, psula. Kitanya Ahi, the Gemara says there's no proof from this brisa because the Pesach Sha'achorei Adeles. What we're talking about when it says patzin, the Gemara clarifies it now. We're talking about a large double post standing at one of the corners of the house, and there's an entire description of where it is, and we have a little bit of a diagram here in which he shows you that, again, it's hard to see it because the diagram itself is on a two-dimensional surface, but what you have is you have like two entranceways into the house, one, let's say on the south side, one on the west side, and you've got now this double post because there are two doorposts over here. And what are we saying about this case where there are two doorposts? That he's got to make sure that it's the Pesach me'achorei hadeles. So it means that corner, which separates these two entranceways, if that corner is a tefach wide, then the two entrances are considered two different entrances, and you require two different mezuzahs. But if, on the other hand, that corner section is less than a tefach wide, so it's like, they almost touch each other, then we're considered as one large entranceway, and therefore the right doorpost is the right side of the southern entrance, and if he places the mezuzah there, that suffices for both entranceways. So the Gemara asks, could this possibly be the pshat in the brisa? When it says in the sefer of the brisa, let's go on, Pesach shachorei adeles, if you have an entrance that's behind the door, and now the question is, do you need another mezuzah? In Yesham tefach tzarich mezuzah acheres. If the entranceway that's behind the door is separated from the door by one tefach, then it becomes a sha'ar, it becomes an entranceway unto itself, and it's mechayiv its own mezuzah. But in lav, if that entranceway behind the door is less than a tefach, eino tzarich mezuzah acheres. So the Gemara, right, which is exactly the same idea that we said before, but why would the Brisa repeat itself? And the Gemara answers, Kate said, Ketani, you have to add two words into the Brisa, and the Brisa's first statement refers to the case of an entranceway behind the door, and the next statement in the Brisa is simply to elaborate and clarify what this first unclear, ambiguous statement is all about. So the Gemara slugs up the Raya, the proof text, to Rav, to support Rav. Tana, we learned in a brisa, Hamid lamal bein shel konim. So usually, a frame is made of wood, but in this case, the frame is made of konim. Konim are very soft, pliable reeds. And what they did was they sort of opened up the inside of the reeds, which is called the shvoferes, and chotek shvoferes umenicha. So the reeds become like a tube, which you open up the inside and clean it out, and then you could place the mezuzah in that hollow section of the reed that you cut open. Omar Rav Acha Berei de Rava, not always is this the right way of putting up a mezuzah inside the hollow of a reed, but rather lo sharu el shehemid ulabasov chatach v'nicha. It means he not only did he go ahead and hollow out the reed, but he also put up the reed in his doorway, and it now serves as a doorpost. And this is again going to lead us to that principle that I mentioned at the outset of tasa v'lo menachos. Because im aval im chatach v'nichal basof hemid, right? So he cuts the reed, puts the mezuzah inside, and then he puts the reed up as the doorway. Psula, that's not a valid way of fulfilling the mitzvah mezuzah, because once again, tasa v'lo menachos. So that's similar to the case we had earlier about the Reish Galusa, that you can't put up the mezuzah before the doorposts are set. Amar Rav Hani Pischei Shimoi Pturim in a mezuzah. Immediately the Gemara asks, what does this mean? Pischei Shimoi, which literally means defective entranceways. Pligi brothers machlokas between Rav Richume and Abba Yossi. Chad Omer, according to one opinion, the less lahu tikra.